Hello, welcome to another Year of Brian Eno video. Sorry it's been a while. As a result of my trip to the UK, which I took at the end of February into March, I decided to switch this series over to a monthly series. It makes a lot more sense doing it that way for a number of different reasons. But so it's going to move over monthly. So in this episode, I'll be doing a review of four main things that came up in the March entries for his diary. And if you want to know more about the series, I suggest you watch episode 0 of this. The sort of introductory episode. And so the other thing I'll do is I will go through the usual 1995 lists in terms of other things that were going on in the month that weren't necessarily connected to his diary, which actually now seems to be taken up a little more. But anyway, we'll roll on and we'll see how we get in this episode. But going forward, so you can expect the next one at the end of April into the first week of May, and it'll be a review of April in the 1995 diary. So the diary starts off with, in that particular month, with a sort of follow-on to a trip he's currently on in Egypt. So at the last minute, or fairly last minute, at the end of February, he gets invited to go out to Egypt. And as a result of this trip, so I'm going to include some links to Egypt, he gets to take a trip down the Nile. Now it looks like he's flown in somewhere near to Cairo, because in the diary it talks about driving to Cairo, and then the boat goes all the way down to around this area here, and I'll talk about where he gets off effectively. Now obviously as they're travelling down the Nile on this boat with his fellow passengers, because he just takes the trip, it's not a family trip, there is a business connection somewhere in there. Obviously there's various stop-off points where he gets to look at places. I'm not going to go through all of them, but he clearly mentions the Valley of the Kings in there. But what you can do with these articles is, if you're interested, you can go through and you can see, like I said, I've included articles about the Nile, and you can see, of course, the Nile goes way beyond Egypt into Sudan, right through Uganda, and then down into here, Lake Victoria. So obviously a major area in Africa of interest for lots of different reasons, alongside, historical reasons going back to antiquity. And I can remember at school, this would have been probably junior school, spending quite a bit of time learning about this area in Egypt, in probably both geography and history, and also, about the time of the pharaohs. Now he ends up at this hotel. I'm assuming it's the same place. This is let me just check the name of it as he refers to it. The Isis Island Hotel, it's called. So this is down near Aswan. So Aswan's down here. And you may well have heard of the Aswan Dam. That's probably that's what I sort of associate it with. And at that point he departs from the boat trip and does his own thing for a little while. Obviously he then travels back to the UK in early April, and a couple of other things that come up in the diary, which occupy quite a lot of the diary for March. Obviously, there's a whole load of other things going on in his life. And as I've said in episodes, I'm not going to cover all of those. I'm just going to normally cover 4 or 5 things per episode. Generally things that sort of, particularly now, that span the whole month. One thing that seems to be taking up a lot of his time is he's working with the band James. And it's a follow-up to an album that he'd been involved with previously, which is the album Wah Wah. So in 95, he starts work on their follow-up album, which went on to be the album Whiplash. Like I said, he'd had involvement with the band before. Now, my familiarity with the band is before 95, and it's mainly through the hit Sit Down, which interestingly was a non-album single. So I remember from late 80s, there was a re-recorded version. And in actual fact, I suspect this may well be the time period when I most became aware of the band. And if we move through, so this is one of the singles from Whiplash, and as you can see, there was a bit of a hole here in their releases during that period in 95. So the album that he's working on with the band didn't come out till 1997, February 1997. But obviously in the diary it's talking about those sort of initial sessions in the studio while they're sort of trying out some tracks. And as it says here, you can see that he was involved with the band since 1993. And it also mentions here that the War album was an experimental album born out of the Lade recordings, so they're going off the back of that from 94. And here it specifically mentions about recording with Eno at the West Side Studio in London. A period of 2 weeks. And there was this really weird period around this time as well, and there was a lot of things going on around the band, and I suspect that contributed to the delay of the release. And again, if you want to read a little bit about the whole background of that album, I'll include a link to that in the description. The other thing he mentions, although he wasn't directly involved with this, and I will tend to do this with films, if he specifically mentions watching a film, I'll sort of flag it up. This actually came out in 1994, but he mentions it in 95. I don't know whether he watched it as a result of the BAFTA Awards. I'm not sure what time of year they came out. I have actually seen this film. It's well worth watching. It's a historical comedy drama and adaptation from a Alan Bennett play called The Madness of King George III. The other thing I remember it for is this title change. So in adapting the play to the film, the director Nicholas Heitner, I think that is, changed the name from The Madness of King George III, The Madness of George III, to The Madness of King George for American audiences to clarify George III's royalty. Because in the UK, most people would know who George III is, well, hopefully. A popular explanation developed that the change was made because there was a worry that American audiences would think that it was a sequel and not go to see it, assuming that they had missed 1 and 2. An interview revealed that that's not totally untrue, but there was also the factor that they felt it necessary to get the word king into the title. And that's sort of the story I'd heard. I hadn't heard this bit, but the fact that people generally might get confused if you call it just Madness of George III, you might think it's a sequel. And you think, well, why did I never see the original? What happened to it? And another thing that's mentioned a lot is the preparation for this self-storage, what would you call it? Not so much exhibition, but installation that he was getting ready for in a place in Wembley. And I'll include a link to the website around that art installation that was done. But yeah, that's obviously he's getting ready for that, and he does talk about, I think, this pyramid business as well. Maybe that's all connected with him. And the trip to Egypt. I know the Egypt trip was very much done at the last minute, based off an offer of a friend of his to go out there, and it was all organised very much at the last minute. So I don't think he necessarily planned to go out originally as part of preparation for this, but certainly it all seems to tie in. Maybe there's also a YouTube video where he talks to takes Robert Sandel on a tour of the self-storage installation. And it looks like he was doing treatments for Laurie Anderson's voice and some artworks. Oops. And then just thinking generally about what was going on around the time period in March. Just leave that up on the screen for a moment. And I think at this point I'll just mention what I was most aware of. And I think it was probably, well, it certainly was this dreadful event. So this is this, was it this sarin poisoning? Yeah. So yeah, I remember obviously that was front and centre in March in the news in the UK. In terms of computer games, this one, Descent, yeah, I definitely remember this. And there was I remember there was a sort of, what would you call it, like a demo version of this available, and this was pretty groundbreaking at the time. So it was a first person shooter, but it had this sort of 6 degrees of freedom going on. So yeah, by today's standard, I imagine the texture map polygons would look pretty low res, but yeah, I certainly remember playing this. So this is the page that I often bring up, connected to, let me just bring up here so you can see 95 in British TV, because sometimes some things pop out. This time around I don't see in the diary him specifically mentioning any premieres of things, which is one of the reasons why I bring this up. Obviously at the time I do remember Absolutely Fabulous being all the rage, and I'm not sure if he's mentioned that series yet. Yeah, not sure. That's the film release for March of 1995. And as I'd mentioned in reference to the Madness of King George, that had already been out since 94. and in the diary he just mentions it, going to the cinema. It's funny, I was talking with my wife the other day about this particular film. For some reason she brought it up. It's an Australian comedy drama, and whether or not I'd seen it, I had actually, but not at this point in time. But as I scroll through these, I think that's the only film I remember from that month. Maybe Funny Bones for some reason, but I'm not sure. And actually Tank Girl, I remember that coming out, although I didn't see that at the cinema, but I remember all the promotion for it. Album-wise, this is probably more where I would have been invested, if you like. So, Life by the Cardigans came out at the first of the month. I don't think he mentions any of these album releases at all in the diary, so this is just purely a parallel reference point, if you like, in terms of what else was going on at that time. So yeah, Grip Inc., which was Dave Lombardo's band. Originally, this is his side project. So Dave Lombardo, if you aren't familiar, is the original drummer from Slayer. There was a lot of like glam metal bands still kicking around, or bands that had been associated with that period, and they were probably on their, slightly deeper into their career, maybe third or fourth album. Wasn't really listening to much of that at the time. We got the presence of the United States of America, the Bends by Radiohead. So, as I've said previously, I was sort of more interested in Britpop at the time and other bands that were running alongside that era in British indie. We've got the Elastica album, the debut album, Everything Is Wrong by Moby. I remember buying that at the time. Smart by Sleeper, Orbis Terrarum by The Orb, Ned's Atomic Dustbin. I was probably into them a slightly earlier period. So what was this referred to as? I'm trying to think of the name of the musical genre. It was an unusual lineup. 2 bass players. Grebo, that was it. Yeah, Grebo. Like this combination of punk rock, dance music, hip hop and psychedelia. Yeah, Pop Will Eat Itself, Ned's Atomic Dustbin, Wonder Stuff, Carter USM. An interesting range of bands that were roped in. I'm trying to remember whether Zodiac, Mind Warp and the Love Reaction was also lumped in with them as well. Relish by Joan Osborne. Yeah, that track, was it One of Us? That was all over the charts. Symbolic by Death. Silverchair had an album out. King for a Day, Fall for a Lifetime, Faith No More. My Brother the Cow by Mudhoney. I wasn't so familiar with Mudhoney at the time. Skid Row were on their third album. We have the Tank Girl soundtrack as well. But yes, certainly at the time, I think the bands I've been most aware of was Faith No More. I was still listening to sort of Death deeper into their career, and then bands like, well, like I said, not so much Ned's Atomic Dustbin, but certainly Elastica and Radiohead. I didn't really get into the Cardigans until a later album. I'm trying to remember the name of the track now. Or the album, is it Gran Turismo? Something like that. Okay, so this is focused on British music events. So the only thing they've got listed here for March is Rennie leaving the Stone Roses. Yeah, their Second Coming tour. So this was their second album, which was like a massive number of years between the first album. So they were touring for that. And I think probably pretty much after this release of this album, they split up, I seem to remember. In terms of the singles charts, I'll just go through, the 4 weeks through. Oops, made a mistake there. I'm in April. It's March we're interested in. So that's the tail end of February. So we got Celine Dion. And then moving into March, which is what we're talking about now. And again, this is going to be very UK centric. I'm just going to look at the top 10. So yeah, Wake Up Boo by Boo Radley's Entrance. That's really what I remember mainly at the time, was the Wake Up Boo single, the single by Boo Radley's. Wow, I'd forgotten that Celine was top of the charts at that point. Oh, wait. It's interesting. Like some weeks I'll look at this and go, yeah, I remember a lot of these singles, but yeah, I don't have a lot of. I remember the Out There Brothers. That's interesting. Okay, so yeah. Okay, so yeah, although I remember the albums from that period, in terms of the releases, the singles charts, yeah, I don't have much recollection. Interesting. Okay, I've updated the Spotify list, so the year of Brian Eno, which just basically contains any release that Brian Eno had some connection to, either as an artist or production, something else, is so I think in the last episode I mentioned that I'd added U2, and this is just going through his whole career, not just 1995, but we're getting close in terms of stuff I've added to that era. And I think next episode I will have added in some stuff from 95. But for this episode I added in the Laurie Anderson album and the previous James album, so this would have been from 93, I think. And in terms of album releases for 95, I've added in everything that I was specifically interested in or subsequently became aware of from March of 1995. So you can see sort of some of the albums that I have already mentioned there. At some point I'd already added in the Cardigans album preemptively. I haven't really updated these lists that much. They're the two lists on YouTube. I'll include the links in the description. But one thing I did do for this list, I did add in, I think it was that one, maybe I got the year wrong. No, for some reason it hasn't appeared. Maybe I've got to just refresh it, could be that. So I've only just added it in. But I did add in to this list this video, the self-storage video. Anyway, thanks once again for watching. Bye for now, and I'll catch you in the next episode.